Now, Sunera Thobani is tonight's speaker. And Sunera is a noted feminist scholar, past president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, the first woman of color to serve in this position. Dr. Thobani's tenure was committed to making the politics of anti-racism central to the women's movement. And in her community work, she's written and spoken on many issues, including the impact of citizenship on women's rights, Canada's immigration and social policy, new reproductive technologies, violence against women, and women and OPEC. In 2001, you may recall, she very bravely spoke out against the hasty resort to war by the Bush administration in the wake of September 11. And I think this is a position that, although it brought controversy at the time, has been vindicated by subsequent events. Professor Thobani teaches in the Women's and Gender Studies program at UVC, so we're very pleased to have her with us tonight. Her lecture is entitled States of Race and Struggles for Social Justice, and of course she'll be happy to take questions because this is, again, Conversations with Activists. Sunera is a really good example of an activist intellectual, so I hope people will have plenty of comments and questions for her after her lecture. Sunera.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to begin by thanking Bill for inviting me here. I'm very honored to have been invited to be part of this series, and it is a pleasure to be here today with you. Before I begin my talk, I actually want to also make another announcement, if that's okay. And this is to promote an event that we're organizing at UVC. I'm also the director of the Raga Center at UVC. And the Raga Center is the Center for Race, Autobiography, Gender, and AIDS Studies. And we are also launching a series on social justice praxis in the community and in the academy. And our series starts this week. It's going to be an event a month. So if you go to the Raga website, on the UBC website, you will see all of the events listed. But the one that I really want to promote is April the 3rd, which is a Sunday, so nobody will have classes here on that day. And we are bringing in Dr. Spivak. She will be talking about her work as an activist. Because, you know, she's promoted a lot for her theoretical contributions, but little is known about her activist work. And so we wanted to look at, our series is going to be profiling different models of social justice praxis, and so we wanted to look at a post-colonial studies model of social justice. And so she will be talking about her work as an activist. So I really would like to promote that event, 3rd of April at UBC. Those of you who can make it, you're very, very welcome. So the talk that I want to give this evening is actually based on a book that has just been published. It's called States of Race. And States of Race was actually edited by, I'm one of the editors. The other two editors are Shireen Razak, whose work many of you will of course be familiar with, and Melinda Smith, whose work also many of you will be aware of. So I want to begin, my talk will be based on the thinking that we did in kind of thinking through and writing the introduction for this book. So my talk will be based on the work that the three of us did collaboratively. But before I do that, I want to contextualize States of Race, where it comes from, and why we actually produced this book. So Race is a cross-Canada network of researchers and scholars of color and of indigenous ancestry, and also scholars who do critical race studies but don't identify as people of color or as being of indigenous ancestry. Our mandate is to promote critical race feminist scholarship, research, and activism in the Canadian context. Race was born 10 years ago And we have organized annual conferences that promotes this kind of scholarship and activism in different parts of the country. And for our 10th anniversary, we wanted to actually document the work that we're doing, which is related to community activism, but also doing work in the academy. And so we actually, this book, it has been written by members of the steering committee of the Race Network. So, why did we think that it was important to promote critical race feminist scholarship in Canada? Research and scholarship are, of course, very, very important, but what race has identified as being of a great deal of significance in our work is that it has to be connected to the lives and the experiences of our communities. The communities that we live in, the communities that we come from, and the communities that we work for. And so that link has been very, very important for us. And although there is significant indigenous population in Canada, and the country has become more ethnically and racially diverse in the early 21st century, indigenous peoples and racial and ethnic minority communities continue to face deeply entrenched systemic and structural barriers to full participation in Canadian society. These inequities, of course, are mirrored in the university, where faculty, staff, and students from these communities are marginalized, often absent. For many, people of color, Aboriginal peoples remain seriously underrepresented within academia as scholars, as researchers, and despite our higher than average levels of education and professional accomplishments, this continues to be the case. Research and scholarship on our experiences in the university is also seriously underdeveloped in this country, especially with regard to issues like disability, sexual orientation, and other forms of oppression that we live with. My own home discipline, which is women's studies, in the early 21st century, for the most part, continues to remain very white in its focus, in its emphasis, in the student body that we service, and of course in the faculty. If we look at women's studies departments across the country, it really is quite shocking how little things have changed. And this is one of the sites in the university that of course we would expect to have a better record than other disciplines, and yet it continues to not only remain very white, but also reproduce white supremacy from my perspective in the teaching practices, in the curriculum, and often we end up training the next generation of people who will think within the kind of framework of white supremacy. And this is true of the other social sciences and humanities as well in Canadian universities. And so for us, the university became a very, very important site for doing this work, for struggling to bring these issues to the forefront. The second reason is that there also is very, very little support for critical race studies at Canadian universities. Critical race studies, of course, is rooted in the decolonization movements and the civil rights struggles of the post-World War II era. Earlier than that, of course, the anti-slavery movement. And critical race studies has since become a well-established interdisciplinary field of academic scholarship, founded by such intellectual luminaries as W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, amongst many, many others. The intellectual legacy of these scholars was institutionalized within older academic disciplines, including sociology, anthropology, and law, and also became foundational to the emerging areas of race and ethnic studies, indigenous studies, black studies, Asian American, and we hope in the case of Canada, Asian Canadian studies, cultural studies, critical race theory, and most recently, of course, whiteness studies. Contemporary scholarship in this field is featured at prestigious international conferences, including those organized by Association of Black Sociologists, Law and Society, the National Women's Studies Association, and a number of many, many other organizations and associations. This scholarship is also profiled in highly reputed international journals such as Race and Class, the Journal of Black Studies, Public Culture, Social Identity, Social Text, etc., etc. In the Canadian context, of course, the scholarship of Patricia Montour Angus, who passed away very recently, unfortunately, Lee Miracle, Himani Banerjee, Shirin Razak, Agnes Kalist, Roxana Ing, among many others, laid the foundation for this interdisciplinary area of study in the late 70s, 1980s. Building on this body of work, a younger generation of critical race scholars has demonstrated that processes of racialization continue to remain foundational to the project of modernity and postmodernity, to transformations in nation-state formations, and to the changing geopolitical order. Despite this strong body of scholarship and intellectual tradition, race continues to be approached in the academic world at universities, in Canada in particular, as the purview of minority special interest groups and relevant only at the level of interpersonal communication at best. At worst, race is treated, largely avoided, I would say, as difficult, divisive issue to address. In the meantime, racial inequalities and forms of exploitation have become even more deeply entrenched within the global system of relations. The inability to discuss these urgent issues in disciplines and in university settings has led to the absence of the development of space and also of a vocabulary that is relevant to our times. This is missing from Canadian universities. And so this was another reason for us to develop the race network, to move away from treating race as being relevant only at the interpersonal level, and to do justice to the hard intellectual work to which our political commitments are anchored. The other reason that was very important for us in the founding of race was to build alliances between scholars of color and scholars of indigenous ancestry, in knowledge production as well as in movement politics. This is a very, very important project for the scholars of color who are involved in the race network. We live on stolen lands. Aboriginal people call the lands we live and work on as lands that were stolen from them. They're still engaged in struggles for sovereignty. And scholars of color need to recognize this. Often there has been a tendency for scholars of color to conflate the situation and the position that we find ourselves in Canada with that of Aboriginal people, by making really lazy equations of, well, we were colonized too. And that becomes a way of avoiding the differential positioning, the differential status, differential access to power between scholars of color and indigenous scholars. We are also racialized in very different kinds of ways, and this needs to be paid a great deal of attention if we are to be engaged in common struggles for social justice. Immigrants, of course, have been treated, and I'm using immigrants here as it is in the Canadian context, as a racialized category that refers to people of color, whether we are actually immigrants or not, whether we were born in this country or not. Immigrants are seen as a source of cheap labor. This has been very central to the way in which we have been racialized in this country. Aboriginal peoples are still seen through the framework of what Aboriginal scholars have identified as the doom to extinction paradigm, right? And so the processes of racialization are very, very different. And we need to really, as scholars of color who are interested in building alliances with indigenous scholars and supporting indigenous movements for sovereignty and social justice, that we not gloss over these inequalities and these very, very different positionings that we have in relationship to the Canadian nation state. So that became a very, very important issue for us as well in the race network to address. and to make sure that these kinds of politics were always front and center in the work that we do both in our own research, our teaching, our scholarship, but our community activism as well. And so that gives you a little bit of background about the formation of the race network, why it continues to remain important for so many of us who are engaged in political activism at different levels. So I now want to turn to look at the context and the issues that we have examined as being relevant to doing this kind of intellectual and political work, and how we actually take these into account as ultimately we look towards building political alliances. So, we began the book by the recognition that Indigenous women first critiqued Canada as a white settler society and led the way in analyzing its ongoing colonial practices. So, for example, Maria Campbell's Half-Breed, published in 1973, was a significant development in feminist, Indigenous, anti-colonial critiques. Half-Breed gave non-Indigenous readers a close-up view of the Canadian settler colonialism lived through the experiences of an Indigenous woman. In an interview with a German journalist, Maria Campbell compared the situation of Indigenous peoples in Canada with the situation in Nazi Germany. And I want to quote her here. She said, "We were busy in the 1940s hearing about the horrible things Germany was doing. Nobody ever would believe that in Saskatchewan at the same time, people were loaded onto cattle cars, not having bathrooms or facilities, and were carted off, hauled someplace, and dumped off in the middle of the snow. And some of those people dying. We never hear those things like that. We need to write these stories ourselves." And of course, Maria Campbell was a leader in writing those stories. Janice Acus noted in the path-breaking collection, Looking at the Words of Our People, First Nations Analysis of Literature, that Campbell's fictionalized autobiography was an important legacy for Indigenous women because it represented them as, quote, as saviors, as survivors of the oppressive colonial regime and abusive relationships, as well as of systemic racism and sexism. Campbell analyzed how settler colonialism operated through the church and schools, wrecking families and leaving in its wake drug and alcohol addiction, self-hatred, internalized racism, and a pervasive racial and sexual violence. But Campbell, as other Indigenous women writers, also showed that Indigenous and Métis women survived those harsh realities, recalling her great-grandmother who successfully resisted both the violence of her Scottish immigrant husband and the eviction from her home when it was designated as a national park. Colonialism has always operated through gender, Lee Maracle wrote, and I want to quote her. Whereas Native men have been victims of the age-old racist remark, lazy, drunken Indian, about Native women, white folks ask, do they have feelings? Native women are neither people nor women. No one makes the mistake of referring to us as ordinary women. A person without feelings can be violated without impunity. Lee Maracle wrote about the very real violence that Native women lived with in I Am Woman. Today, with hundreds of Indigenous women going missing and being murdered, we confront daily what Indigenous scholars, including Andrea Smith, mean when they write that sexual violence is how you do colonialism. When women of color and immigrant women examine the forms of our own oppression, we need to do so with the analysis of Campbell, Maracle, and others, such as Métis scholar Emma LaRouche, being central in the framework that we develop to understand our own experience. In my hometown, Northern Canada, South Africa, LaRouche's powerful poem, she reminds us that the colonial histories and histories of enslavement and colonialism out of which we ourselves come from the third world, and the realities of racism we now confront in Canada must be linked to the white settler colonial project in which we find ourselves. For many, this has been a very hard connection to sustain. It has been so much easier to forget for scholars, including scholars of color, that this continues to remain stolen land, and that Indigenous men, women, and children continue to bear the ongoing violence of dispossession on their bodies. The challenge to academics of color, of course, has been, as Shireen put the question, how to theorize our place when place is stolen land. This challenge remains the preeminent one for anti-racist feminists as we struggle to understand our own oppression, as well as our relatively increased access to social power and our relative access to privileges in relationship to Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples generally. Whereas Indigenous women are constructed as women without feelings, to use Lee Merkel's words, women of color are often imagined as women who have only feelings. As Himani Banerjee wrote in the anthology Returning the Gaze, people think of women of color as non-intellectual, emotional, quote-unquote, mindless nurturers. Himani pointed out that they publish our poetry, but not our theory. Echoing Trinity Minha, she pointed out that, quote, "We are the voice of difference they long to hear. We are often the nation's fetish object." For Banerjee, this meant that we had to stop the practice of conceptualizing oppression in terms of unitary categories of gender, race, or class. She called for an integrative analysis and situated herself as an anti-racist feminist Marxist scholar. Eschew romantic notions of voice and energy, Banerjee advised scholars of color. Resist the specialness invoked for fetishes. Instead, apply Marxist concept of mediation and track how social relations come into production through each other. Indeed, many Black and Asian feminist scholars relied on Marx to theorize how race, class, and gender operated simultaneously in the oppression of racialized women in Canada. In 1989, Makeda Silveira published Silenced, an exploration of the lives of Black women who could only enter Canada as domestic workers. Silenced was a compelling description of both the racial state and the everyday racism that Black domestic workers encountered. Around the same time, Agnes Caliste began her research on Black sleeping car porters, domestic workers, and nurses. What these studies showed was that the labor market was both gendered and raced, but these effects could not be understood as discrete systems of oppression, but rather as interlocking. Using race as the entry point, these feminist scholars explored the limitations of segmented labor theory and argued that from an anti-racist viewpoint, it was possible to track the racialization of both gender and class. Caliste concluded that, quote, "Racially specific notions of femininity and masculinity played an important role in justifying the restriction of Black women and men to menial and back-breaking jobs such as domestic work, chronic care nursing, and portering, as well as conditioning managerial strategies of control. White nurses often collaborated with management to harass Black nurses," Caliste's research reported, "as clear an indicator as any that gender could not be theorized outside of race and class. On the ground, the implications of an interlocking analysis for feminist anti-racist organizing were clear. Black nurses, for example, found themselves confronting the state, their employers, and their own unions. Roxana Ng showed how immigrant women were made, produced that is, as a labor market category and as commodities to be bought by employers in a process in which community agencies that operated on their behalf played a salient role. The work produced by the women who founded Researchers and Academics of Color for Equality, the RACE network, was an important part of the theorizing of these interlocking systems of oppression. Patricia Montior, an indigenous scholar, anchored her feminism in an anti-colonial analysis. Provocatively, she stated, quote, "Equality is not a high standard in my way of thinking." Montior explained why a white feminist analysis where violence against Aboriginal women was an issue of what men did to women remained impossible for her to adopt. Violence is, she argued, not just a mere incident in the lives of Aboriginal women. Violence does not just span a given number of years. It is our lives, and it is our histories. For most Aboriginal women, violence has not been escapable. This is what Patricia Montior kept raising and insisting upon at every race conference and meeting that she was present at. A cyclone of pain is how she defined it. Violence had to be understood as colonization itself. From residential schools to dispossession and to sexual violence within their communities, Aboriginal women encounter a legally sanctioned violence that they do not share with other women. A feminism that failed to recognize the impact of settler colonialism, one that focused on equality without addressing issues of sovereignty, was for Montior Angus not a useful solution. Indeed, she concluded, quote, "Canadian laws are not an Aboriginal answer." And she went on to argue, "For me, solutions are located in the collective memory of my people and our ancestors, and not in constitutional reform. Our survival as a people has always depended on our creativity and not on a political power-sharing relationship with the federal government." In a bid to understand how race, class, and gender operate through each other in the white settler colonial project, Shireen Razak considered the gendered racial violence enacted on Pamela George, an Aboriginal woman who was brutally murdered by two white men during an encounter in prostitution. Insisting that we understand the encounter as fully colonial, Razak proposed that what brought Pamela George to prostitution the night of her death and what brought the two men to enact violence against her must be seen as a central aspect of an ongoing colonialism. The men knew themselves as men and as colonizers through practices of violence, Razak argued. Pamela George came to this encounter dispossessed and unable to survive except through prostitution. In my own book, Exalted Subjects, I've argued that we should consider the constitution of the Canadian national subject through a genealogy of colonial forms of power. White citizens, exalted as the rightful owners of the land, draw on their entitlement as colonizers of indigenous peoples to manage all racial others in the national territory. Offering a detailed analysis of the gender basis of this project, I've maintained that we cannot begin to unpack the category of the citizen in all its racial and gender dimensions unless we begin with colonization. It is the insight that colonization is ongoing and that it is a process, a project that is sustained by interlocking systems of oppression that has most distinguished Canadian feminist anti-racist project. Of course, the political climate of 9/11 and the launching of the War on Terror shaped the environment in which the Race Network was founded and in which the current scholars who belong and activists who belong to the Race Network do their work. Indigenous women and women of color have historically been differently and unequally located, as I argued earlier, within the Canadian nation state, both in relation to Canadians and in relation to each other. And these divisions and these inequalities have actually been deepening in the early 21st century in the post-9/11 context. The racial and gendered politics of the state were organized through a complex triangulation of relations, with indigenous peoples marked for physical and cultural extinction, which carries on. European settlers for integration into the national project, which also carries on, and the ties with the US have become even stronger as Canada has very enthusiastically embraced this redefinition of the West as endangered by its Muslim other. And so we see that the Islamophobia that has erupted in most of the Western world in the post 9/11 period in Canada has become a major grounds upon which Canadian integration into white supremacy and into unashamedly claiming belonging to a civilization that is superior culturally and politically is being organized. And so today we see that Islamophobia has become central to how Canadians are integrated into nationality through the exaltation of their being part of this community of the West that has been defined as the real target of the 9/11 attacks. And people of color, of course, in this triangulated relation have remained as perpetual outsiders, as immigrants, newcomers, visible minorities, all of which are categories that racialize us and place us firmly outside the community of the nation. In the post 9/11 period, the historically anti-immigrant and anti-refugee discourses have coalesced around the figure of the Muslim other, where the Muslim, the category Muslim, no longer operates as just a religious category, but as a racialized category. If we look at who has been targeted for increased state surveillance at the borders, in the media, if we look at who has been put under this hyper-vigilance, we see that it is not only people who are practicing Muslims. It is anybody who, quote-unquote, looks like a Muslim. And who looks like a Muslim is defined as black and brown bodies. And so in the UK, for example, we had the British security forces shooting and killing a Brazilian man to death as a suspect, as a terrorist suspect, because, quote-unquote, he looked like a Pakistani. In the immediate post 9/11 moment, we saw Sikhs being attacked. We saw Hindus being attacked. We saw Sikh temples and Sikh gurudwaras and Hindu temples being desecrated. And so when we look at how the category Muslim operates today, it operates as a racial category and much less as a religious category, in the way that the state is constructing and then targeting particular bodies as a threat to the nation and its survival. And this form of racialization that has become prominent in the post-9/11 era is, of course, also thoroughly gendered, because the Muslim woman has been constructed as the hyper-victim of Islam, of Muslim men, and she has become the alibi that has been used to justify the war on terror, the invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. And so we see that processes of racialization have undergone a major shift in the post 9/11 period, and that we now live with forms of racialization that are only now becoming visible to us, that we can track and start to organize against and around. And as we do this work, as we fight against the changes that are being made to Canadian society, which will be very profound changes, we have seen, in the name of defending the West through the war on terror, an outright attack on multiculturalism, which, flawed as it was and problematic as it was at least some kind of token recognition that people of color had made a significant contribution to Canada. And even though it organized what Himani Banerjee has called a form of ethnic citizenship, and what I myself have argued, that it played a key role in the reproduction of white supremacy by defining people of color as different in relation to the core of the nation, which remained bilingual and bicultural British and French, even though I myself have been highly critical of multiculturalism. Today we see not even the need to make a token recognition of the contributions of people of color. And so we see a much more virulent form of white supremacy that has permeated the public sphere and that has permeated state policy and that is actually being used to rebuild the transnational alliances between those countries that define themselves as being part of the West. So race, states of race, these are the kinds of issues that we have looked at in states of race. And race continues to provide a forum, a platform for this kind of scholarship to be profiled, for networks to be built between the different scholars and researchers and the different communities in which we do our political activism, to try and build partnership, to try and build alliances so that we can actually make real the project of social justice in this country. Thank you. I will end now, and maybe we can take
Floor is open.
Is it the significance of the imprisonment of Leonard Peltier and John Graham in recent decades?
Sorry, I can't hear you. Can you stand up and speak a bit louder?
Yeah. The world's longest held indigenous political prisoner is Leonard Peltier, extradited from British Columbia in 1975.
Yes.
Canada's longest held political prisoner is John Graham, also indigenous.
Yes.
Extradited 3 years ago. Can you speak to their significance in the context of racism?
Yes, well, of course, you know that incarceration of Aboriginal people, both men and women, has been a very, very major issue, both in the US and in Canada. And Patricia, although she didn't speak specifically to Leonard Peltier's case, Patricia Montour-Angus actually argues in States of Race that there is more work that has been done on Aboriginal women in the prison system than there has been done on Aboriginal women within the educational system. Right? And she says this is a measure of the status of Aboriginal women. And she argues, she actually defines the prison system, the residential school system, the education system as all part of this continuum of kind of the colonial violence that is done to Aboriginal peoples. So certainly, yes, I know that, you know, certainly Leonard Peltier's case, there's a huge international campaign around that. And incarceration, prison, the treatment of Aboriginal men and women by the justice system, or the injustice system as they call it, has been very central to shaping Aboriginal life and Aboriginal politics, both in the US and Canada. And you know, Patricia Montour-Angus's work in this area was specifically around Aboriginal women in the prison system in Canada.
I'd like to say, first of all, I remember very clearly when you spoke out after 9/11 and how you were singled out for criticism. And I remember thinking, being so grateful for you speaking out, and how it was like a few people in the United States, a few congresswomen in the United States that spoke out. So I commend you and appreciated what you did at that time. I wonder, though, a little, perhaps not exactly germane to what you're talking about, but I wonder if you care to comment about events in the Middle East right now, particularly Libya, and how you see the situation.
How I see the situation? Well, I see the situation as a very, very, of course, a very, very important moment. I see it as, an incredibly inspiring moment. I think it is very centrally tied to the events of 9/11. I think it is tied to the losing of the Americans of the Afghan war and the Iraq war. I think that is part of the equation that has spurred these movements. And I think that we live in a changed geopolitical order, which has been transformed, whatever the outcome is in Libya. And of course, you know, the violence is to be condemned, and you know, how long Gaddafi will last. I haven't seen the news today. I keep thinking every hour I should check and see if it's still there. But I see it as an incredibly hopeful moment. I see it as a very, very positive moment. And I see it as a revival of what used to be called the Third World Project, which was defeated by the imposition of dictators in the Third World by Western powers, which allowed a form of imperialism to continue. So I see it as a very, very hopeful moment that the Third World Project, which was incredibly inspiring in the 50s and 60s in the wake of the decolonization movements, and there was great hope and energy for a real transformation of the geopolitical order, that of course was defeated. And you know, globalization of course was a huge part of the defeat of the Third World Project. Imposition of structural adjustment programs, privatization, you know, we all know what the neoliberal agenda has done to the Third World. But I see this as an incredibly hopeful moment of transformation, great potential, great promise. The US has been greatly eroded. The power of the US has been greatly eroded. So I see it as an incredibly positive and hopeful moment. You know, and of course, I'm just thrilled to see that, you know, the women are out there in the streets, the women are part of the organizing. They clearly seem to be playing a very key leadership role. And so, you know, I don't know what else could more stunningly shatter the stereotype that has developed of the Muslim woman as abject, passive victim who needs to be saved. And you know, I hope that feminists are sitting up and taking notice, because feminists seem to be, in the Western world, seem to be the least able to understand what's happening in the Middle East right now. You know, I was invited to give a talk, and I gave a talk, and I began at that time, Mubarak had just left, and I spoke to this class to which I'd been invited to talk. I said, isn't this an incredibly exhilarating moment? It was a women's studies class, and a student put up her hand and she said, you know, we don't know what the Egyptian woman wants, so how can we say this is a positive moment? And for me, there was nothing more bankrupt than a feminist politics that could take you to that kind of a reading of what was happening in Egypt at that time. So I think that what is happening in the Middle East is certainly, from my perspective, incredibly inspiring. Whatever the outcome, it has transformed global politics. It is transforming the relationship between the North and the South. And, you know, whatever happens, whether, you know, how strong the counter-revolution will be, of course it will be there. Whatever happens, we have entered a new stage in global politics. And, you know, I'm, of course, rooting for the best outcome, and I just find that I didn't think I would live to see this day in my lifetime. I did not think that I would live to see Mubarak go. I did not think that I would live to see this day. So for me, it's incredibly exhilarating.
Thank you.
Do you not think it's a little hypocritical that the G8 is, and many of them involved in Afghanistan and Iraq, continue to claim how vile it is that he should be killing his own people, but it's not, it was never considered to be that vile, riveting everyone up to even invade the U.S. for what they did in Afghanistan. And isn't this another reflection of the treatment of the Muslims?
You know, yeah, it does certainly, there's a lot of hypocrisy of it, and you know, when I look at the kind of here, the sanctimonious piety in the news media coverage, oh, they've just toppled their dictatorship. This morning on CBC, there was a report about lots more dictators in sub-Saharan Africa to get rid of, and at one time I would have been enraged by comments like that. You know, who put those people in power? Who have been supporting them? Who has been arming them? Right? Who has been protecting them? Who is it? And I would have been enraged, but this morning it was absurd. All I could do was laugh at it and just say, you know, the hypocrisy is clearly there, but it's such an exhilarating moment, and this kind of papering over that, oh, we had nothing to do with their dictators, look how old those people were. It's just become absurd to see how quickly political commentators and media commentators are running to, defend the revolution and distance themselves from their own politics. And of course in Canada, all of this hypocrisy that they can continue to run the Globe and Mail series on how women in Afghanistan still really need to be saved, and this is Canada's responsibility even after the troops withdraw. That's one reason why we should be there, because we're saving little Afghan girls and allowing them to go to school at the same time as they are, rooting for Mubarak to go, and now of course they've turned on Gaddafi. It really is, the hypocrisy of course has always been there. But it really is an intensely exciting moment, which is revealing those hypocrisies to anybody who is half interested in any of these topics.
Like the woman who spoke before, I really want to thank you for when you spoke out in the wake of 9/11, but I also really want to thank you for being the first woman of color who was the president of NAC. And I know that was a very, very challenging road to hoe. It's interesting that a women's studies class thinking about Egypt would never have heard of Nawal al-Saadawi, such a well-known feminist activist in Egypt. But the question I wanted to ask you is something that I've been struggling with trying to interpret, and that is that in the wake of the uprising in Egypt, there was a day when the coverage of the uprising, at least on the American networks, was pushed aside by the coverage of the sexual assaults of two white, in fact blonde, women reporters. And the particular ways in which I've read this described, you talked about gender and race and the intersection there. And it seems to me, of course, we must be concerned about an assault, a sexualized assault. But it seems to me a reinscription of a particular idea of men who are colored. And I don't even want to say Muslim men, because what seems to be arising again is you have this contrasting image of this ravening black man and this blonde, innocent victim. And it seems to me a reinscription of what we saw in the American South in so many ways. But I've been trying to pick that apart, and I was wondering if you were aware of that coverage and if you had some thoughts about it.
Right, okay, so I'll take your first point first, though. I know it wasn't a question, but
Yeah.
when you talked about NAC.
Yeah.
And I really want to say something about what has happened to the women's movement in Canada, both towards the end of 2000, but also in the post 9/11 moment. And I think what has happened in the post 9/11 moment in the women's movement in Canada, the US, is that it became a moment that white feminists could actually completely discredit and marginalize anti-racist feminism yet again. And I think that not just NAC, but the work that we were trying to do in transforming the women's movement in Canada, there were many, many women of color who were active outside NAC as well as inside NAC. And it was the goal of transforming feminist politics in this country so that it became anti-racist, anti-colonial feminist politics, was a very important moment, and we were pushing through changes which were beginning to have some effect, and there was transformation that was taking place of the women's movement in this country. After 9/11, what we saw was the rise of a liberal white feminism again, which partnered with the Canadian state, and the basis of that partnership was saving Afghan women. The same thing happened in the US, and what we saw is the rise of white liberal feminism, which previously had come under a great deal of critique in the feminist movement, but it transformed itself with this alliance with the state and by leading the Islamophobic discourse, right, which constructed Muslim men as hyper-patriarchal, Muslim women as hyper-gender victims, and that was the basis on which we saw the resurgence of a white liberal feminism that specifically was targeting and marginalizing anti-racist and anti-colonial feminist politics in this country. So that's one thing that I want to say about what has happened to the Canadian women's movement. In terms of the sexual assaults, of course, it's fairly typical. Anybody can predict that that will get all the coverage. But, you know, there was an early report, and this is one thing that I don't want to say too much about. There was an early report that said that she had actually been assaulted by security forces. That report disappeared very quickly, and, you know, I want to do some research to find out who actually it was that was involved in this. And the earliest report that I saw about it reported it as an assault by security forces, okay? Which would make the picture very different than Arab men in a crowd in an Arab city, right? And yet the media focus and the media representation, we know that the media has become a preeminent site for the promotion of Islamophobic narratives and the kind of, you know, the targeting of Muslim men in particular as hyper-misogynist. And so I think that it's really important that when these issues are reported, that we're very careful and look at, you know, what the whole story is. Because there are such distorted versions that we end up getting, particularly in the North American media.
Sunera, I wonder if you could comment, again, thinking about Libya, but connecting it to indigenous struggles, the danger in, that is coming out quite prominently now with the threat to the oil supply and the need to develop the tar sands. The connection between that justification discourse for the nation, the white nation, and indigenous struggles against environmental racism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I think environmental racism is a huge, huge project, you know, for us to address and to pay attention. I have not personally done much work on the tar sands, I have to say, but clearly the connection is very clearly there. The other issue I think that is also really important to think through, which also has connection to the kind of anti-racist work that we're doing here, is the use of migrant labor, right? In Libya and in many other parts of the Middle East, in these oil-producing countries. So no, I think you're absolutely right to point that as a really important issue to address. I haven't done any work on the tar sands myself, so, you know, there's nothing that I can say that would be specific enough to be useful to this. But clearly, this is a major, major issue that needs to be addressed.
Can you please speak to a white Western feminist women's studies student? Beyond the idea of anti-racism, what do you see as the white nation actually doing? What do you see citizens like myself actually doing in concrete ways that make this, that move towards this social justice paradigm and this, you know, better world for all? Like, what are some key concrete things you see?
Well, the first thing that I've done in my own work is to unpack the category of citizen, right? And so I think when we use categories like that to kind of identify ourselves, yeah, that's deeply problematic. Because Canadian citizenship, of course, is founded on the dispossession of Aboriginal people and the colonization of Aboriginal people. And people of color, of course, who were excluded from citizenship, fought for access to citizenship, its rights, its entitlements. I myself am an immigrant, so I know what the importance is of citizenship status. But citizenship continues to remain an institution that organizes the ongoing dispossession of Aboriginal people. In fact, Val Napoleon has argued that citizenship is what she calls the final solution to Aboriginal people. And so I think in whichever ways we identify ourselves, and for me, citizen is a particularly problematic category, and that needs to be transformed. We need to rethink it in a way that does not continue to reproduce all of these colonial practices, and yet we are so invested in this language, in the notion of rights and entitlements, and of course today in the idea of global citizens as somehow a better kind of way to be thinking about social justice. So I really, I hate to say this is what we should do, but the first thing you should do is to refuse to use classifications, categories like that unproblematically. We have to start thinking of them, approaching them, using them, and particularly in our political organizing, we have to organize around them in a way that is transformative rather than reproducing of these kinds of power relations. In the context of Canada, I think a big project for us in States of Race has been to continue naming Canada as a settler colonial society, which reveals a different set of relationships between the people who live and work and die in this country, as opposed to calling it as a liberal democratic society. Right? Himani Banerjee, of course, has argued that Canada is a colonial settler state that is trying to transform itself into a liberal democratic society. Right? So for us, keeping the focus on, if you start off with analyzing Canada and what we do and our status here and how we live as a colonial settler society, you come up with a very different notion of social justice, you come up with a very different notion of political organizing around it. So I think the most important thing I can say is that we have to stop using these categories unproblematically. We have to recognize that the foundational kind of relationship on which the Canadian nation state is founded is colonialism and racialization. And our politics have to begin from that place. Whatever politics we're doing, whether it's in the feminist movement, whether it's anti-poverty, whether it's anti-globalization, whatever way we're trying to find our way towards social justice, it has to begin with this framework, and it has to begin with the recognition that unless that framework is transferred, we cannot be, moving towards a project of social justice.
Hi, I just want to say thank you for everything that you've shared. My name is Sunera Thobani, and I'm mixed blood on both sides of my family. On my mom's side, I'm Irish and Métis from the Métis Nation. On my dad's side, I'm Anishinaabe and white. And I'm a women's studies student, and thank you for speaking to the power relations in that discipline, because it's not something that you get to hear about very much. But this isn't so much a question, but I guess it's a challenge that I feel like I faced, and even as a white woman with a lot of mobility in the classroom and in the university context. I'm the first person in my family to finish high school and go to university and everything, but nonetheless I get a lot of immediate status of authority as a white woman. And so in that way, some of the things I can say in the classroom are really palatable to primarily white room of classmates. But then some things can't be glossed over in that the project of decolonization of my family involves the reclamation of land literally, right? And that land is occupied. And so I guess the discipline of women's studies hasn't given me much to speak to that. And I wonder if you have any, I guess it's not really a question, but I just wanted to say that, and why should we stick with it?
What is this? When we look at who would argue that Lee Maracle's work is not feminist, right? Who would argue that Patricia Monchor Angus wasn't a feminist? Who would make that argument, right? Except for maybe women's studies. But who else would make that argument? Right? And so why would we give up that ground? Why would we give up that experience? Why would we give up? Because that has to be, it's part of our politics as well. Right? Gender is very much central to our anti-racist, anti-colonial project. As Andrea Smith says, sexual violence is how you do colonialism. And so why would you not address that sexual violence? Why would you give that space up and say, no, actually, yes, indeed, white woman is the universal woman? Why, right? And so these continue to remain sites of struggle, very important sites of struggle. And we need to recognize that indigenous women, women of color, actually have claimed that ground. And, you know, many of us are not ready to give it up. Yeah?
You spoke to the state of feminism and women's studies in Canada. I'm wondering if you could comment on the way that you see universities in Canada currently training human service professionals, educators, social workers, counselors, and those types of things, and if you've had the opportunity to collaborate with those types of departments to generate curriculum.
Well, we have some members of race here who are also, you know, very active in social work, right? So maybe one of you wants to say that. Yes, why not? Yes. Can you repeat your question again?
Yeah, I just wanted to know about, I'm in child and youth care, so I was curious about what you might have to say to this, like the state of human service training in Canada and how to bring these issues into the curriculum that I'm kind of experiencing.
So,
I think that Teresa Macias, I teach at the School of Social Work, and I am a member of race. I think one of the things that I can say is there's been a shift thanks to the contribution of academics of color in fields like social work. There's been a shift. And also people, colleagues that do critical work on understanding whiteness and power and privilege and how that determines how we perceive ourselves as helpers. And how that is
But here's one thing that I will say, is the discussion around social work, of course, has been identified as a key site for the reproduction of white supremacy by indigenous women, particularly in the area of child apprehension. And that has been a major, major issue that indigenous women have organized around and continue to organize around. And as Teresa mentioned, you know, this has been a very important place at the site at which white women have constructed themselves as quote-unquote helpers, as savers, and in the process have kind of furthered, right, the extension of white norms, white cultural practices, trying to impose them on indigenous people and Aboriginal families and communities. So certainly, you know, the indigenous scholars who are involved with the race network have identified this as an incredibly important and problematic site for their political activism.
I'm also from social work, Teresa, thank you for that, but I just wanted to say this little bit of patting ourselves on the back. We use your work in our curriculum, and actually every single person that you have mentioned tonight, Emma LaRoque, Lee Marical, Val Napoleon's article about citizenship is in our law course. So we are working very hard. You know, we can't guarantee how students will engage with that, but we understand that the history of social work is inextricably linked with the colonial project. And so unpicking that is absolutely critical, the only way forward for us.
I would say that just one part jumped out at me, and that's the history of social work. I would say it's more the reality of social work as it exists today in British Columbia for Indigenous women. The legal tests that surround the best interests of the child are filtered through that colonial lens, and it results in astronomical amounts of Indigenous children in care.
And of course, Marley Klein wrote about how the bad Aboriginal mother was one of the kind of archetypes that continue to shape social work as a paradigm here in Canada. And so not just the best interest of the child, but also the Aboriginal woman as a deficient mother has been very central to how social workers have approached relations with Indigenous communities.
Sunera, thanks very much for your talk. It was great. I wanted to ask two questions. One is, I was wondering if you could share with us your ideas about how you perceive locating struggles in the sense of local struggles, international, global struggles, pan-Canadian struggles, in the sense of, where, well, we just came through a struggle here at UVic related to the McLean's racist article about too many Asians on campus. And it was part of actually a fairly wide-scale fight back in a number of different provinces. One of the things we perceived is that it's very difficult to sustain pan-Canadian networks, and race is a good example of one that has sustained itself, but only through a lot of work, hard work. And so I'm just trying to I'd like to get a sense from you about how you personally perceive the relative importance or the networking process, local, global, pan-Canadian, hemispheric, etc. And the second question is, in regards to sort of vision for the future. I mean, I think that the work that's been done and the race networks work that's come out of this has been incredibly important. And I'm also looking if you have any personal insights into the visions that are being generated for the future, of where we're going. I understand problematizing things, developing critical perspectives on things is essential, but also we need things that will bring us together and transform what we're confronting, locally, globally, etc.
Yes. Okay. I think actually that's a very important question, and I wish that I had better answers than what I'm going to say. I don't actually have answers because that's what I struggle with all the time. I think that these kinds of networks in the Canadian situation are very, very underdeveloped. When I look at the kind of activism of scholars of color, much more developed in places even like the U.S. than in the Canadian situation. We are so beleaguered and so isolated in the spaces that we occupy in the university. These networks are very, very undeveloped, even across the university, let alone kind of, at a pan-Canadian level. And I think that this has to become a very, very important issue that we address. Of course, the McLean's article sparked off organizing on campuses, many, many different parts of the country, but of course, sustaining it and actually translating it into some meaningful change has been much, much harder to do. We all organized forums and had discussions about it, but to move it on to the next step has been very, very difficult. Race is one place where we have been able to sustain this kind of cross-Canada network. Not only that, but we regularly have American, European scholars who also come to our conferences. But race had a very, very large vision. And this kind of scholarship was just one part of our vision. Right? A central part of our vision was advocacy. And we've not been able to do that because we just, don't have the resources. Everybody's stretched too far. When I think about the visions for the future, I say that what was happening in the Middle East is incredibly inspiring. It's incredibly, rejuvenating. But when I look at the situation here in Canada, North America, it's a very, very dismal situation. When we look at political life today in this country, it is dismal. And when we look at the vision, what is the vision? And one interesting way in which I think that I've been able to understand this better through looking at what is happening in the Middle East is the Canadian left, the left in Europe, the left in the US have all kind of jumped on, wonderful, this is a real workers' struggle, this is a real struggle for democracy and secularism. Nobody wants to talk about Islam. Nobody wants to talk about pictures of millions of people praying in the square as they're fighting against their governments, right? And so this kind of recasting of it is, oh, it really is, this is the real workers' movement, this is the real youth struggle, this is the real socialist project, right? That's the only way in which the left and what we would call progressive thinkers have been able to support and accept what is happening in the Middle East. And for me, the vision of politics in this country is so thoroughly infused by Islamophobia, right? And I think that when we look at visions for change, left movement, feminist movement in North America have not been able to transcend the kind of, you know, racial politics that are deeply infused in their own movements, right? And it became so apparent to me as I was, you know, reading commentators talking about how wonderful these revolutions were, but they could not step outside of understanding it except from within their own categories and within the goals of their own movements, right? And in that way, I think they've been unable to really pay attention to who these people actually are that are making this revolution, right? And we see very clearly what these communities are. You see very clearly veiled women coming out, protesting, standing in front of tanks, right? Putting their children on tanks, right? Confronting soldiers. And yet the vision that we have for social justice or social change cannot even begin to understand their politics, right? The only politics we can understand is if the unveiled women are there, if the urban women are there, if the English-speaking women are there. That's the only context in which we have to kind of try and build alliances with these incredibly strong, powerful, revolutionary movements that are emerging. And I think that unless this kind of rethinking of the deeply embedded kind of, you know, racial assumptions, racial politics that fuels social justice movements, whether it's the labor movement, the anti-poverty movement, feminist movement, in the North, in Canada and the US, until it actually is able to transform itself into, you know, a kind of anti-racist, anti-colonial vision, I think that the possibilities for global alliances will always remain very, very limited. Yeah?
What kind of contribution the colored woman in Canada can have to our society in order to bring people together in our struggle against the capitalist attack on our society? We are being really railroaded. We have a government that is implementing corporate agenda.
Yes.
So what kind of contribution colored woman can bring to the table, and what should be the rest of us pay attention to?
Well, you know, I mean, the contributions that women of color have made have been very central to how we've come to understand Canadian society, right? On issues of immigration, women of color have written about the racialized, the gendered politics that shape immigration in this country, that shape settlement program services, and ultimately that shape the nation state in this society, right? So women of color have been very central in developing a kind of anti-racist and anti-patriarchal understanding of the Canadian state and the Canadian nation, right? Women of color have developed major strategies for doing solidarity work across community boundaries, across community borders, right? And so we've built organizations, you know, I don't know, I mean, the project that I've been describing, States of Race, has a lot of women of color who are the scholars, activists, researchers who belong to this network. So, in a way, I've been talking about the contribution, right, that women of color have been making, both to the intellectual project of knowledge production, but also to the very important political project of community organizing. I don't know if you have a more specific kind of question than that.
I just wanted to ask, my understanding of the question is something to do with the consumptive paradigm or materialism. Is that what you're asking about, or did I miss it?
I'm just confused about the discussion that's going on. I just want to know, in terms of Canadian society, we are seeing the so-called uprising in other lands. But what about us? We are under attack. Our society is under attack. And we are losing it big time. It's just coming. And I want to know what kind of contribution feminism and especially the women of color in Canada can bring to the table and contribute to our defense of our society and our struggle against corporate agenda. So that is the most important thing for us to consider. So I want to know the contribution of color women in this struggle.
Well, and let me try this another way. Women of color have built organizations that have challenged and mobilized for workers' rights, right? The farm workers movement in BC, for example, women of color, South Asian women have played a very important role in that. Yeah? If we look at domestic workers, Filipino women are playing a major role in speaking out against the kind of exploitations and the violations of domestic workers, right? That takes place not only in Canada but also at the global level. Women of color have been involved in organizing anti-globalization protests and anti-globalization movements. So I'm not sure where your question is going, because clearly activists in all of these movements, women of color, are present in all of these movements, and we've organized and we've helped to develop the analysis of the corporate agenda as not just a class-based issue, but also as a race and gender issue. Yeah? So women of color have been, I think, playing a major role in many of these anti-corporate politics, anti-globalization movements, at the social forum that are organized. Women of color have been very actively involved in this.
Can you contrast the way CBC portrays these issues vis-a-vis Democracy Now?
Oh dear. Well, I think that, how would you contrast it? Yes, CBC is a nation-building institution. It's going to represent issues from a particular Canadian, corporate, elite, white male perspective most of the times. White women's perspective in CBC is not that much different. Democracy Now, on the other hand, is left. It claims to be feminist. It's going to present a kind of alternate representation. But, on many issues, sometimes they will converge. On many issues, they sometimes will represent issues particularly to do with women in the third world, Muslim women, in very, very similar terms. Yeah? So I would say that even though their politics are clearly different, their class commitments are very, very different, their gender politics are very different, but when it comes to Islam, when it comes to Muslim women, Muslim men, very often they will converge. You will have similar kinds of representations come out from both. There was another hand up there?
I was just going to make a comment from what I've learned so far. One of the things that I think feminist scholarship has really been working on is the shedding intersectional light on divisive tools that break alliances apart and keep us from working together. So, I'm going to highlight it.
Well, okay, that's, I start from a different place. I don't look at it from the point of view that this kind of intersectional analysis helps us to work against the divisions that exist. I think we start from a different place. We realize that these divisions are real, that they are material, that they have consequences, and so the project of transforming those divisions has to be central to our politics. So I wouldn't, for example, take the line that racism is a tool that the bourgeoisie uses to divide the working class. Right? I wouldn't take that kind of position. I would argue that the working class is extremely divided. That, drawing on Roxana Ames' work, Himani Banerjee's work, that race actually, we cannot think of class as political, as economic and materialist based, but race is not. Right? That race is just a tool that divides the working class. So I would argue against a perspective. I would actually seek to complicate class analysis by drawing on Fanon's work, for example, and look at how race actually divided, right? What we call the working class at the global level, so that their interests actually were opposed to each other. They were not just being divided against each other by the bourgeoisie, but their material location and their interests were in conflict with each other. And Fanon, of course, argued for his time, which, of course, you can't apply that unproblematically today, but he argued that in the Third World, it was not the proletariat that was a revolutionary class. Right? He had a very complicated class analysis of the colonial order and the colonial situation. So, treating it as just kind of, building unity across divisions and seeing divisions as imposed from the above is not, wouldn't be my starting place. I would look at it how materially we are placed unequally and differently. And often, yes, our interests are in conflict with each other. And if we really want to work across those politics, it's not just a process of building a kind of common, united political position, but actually transforming those material conditions as well. Yeah? So just adding more to what you're saying, my starting point would be different.
I know this is very late for this question.
Okay.
And maybe I'd love to sit with you at another time to discuss it in length, but I'm very curious, because this issue weighs heavily on my own heart. How would you apply a critique of race and gender to the Palestinian-Israeli crisis? I know it's an extremely loaded question, and I apologize in advance for that, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it, because it's something I've never read in your writings, and I'm sure it's there.
Well, I am writing more on this issue. I actually went to Gaza last year, and I'm becoming much more involved. So I will be writing more about this. But of course, race and gender are central to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the way I would kind of think about that is, if we look at Israel, a state, a Zionist state that claims to be representative of the Jewish people around the world, and yet when we look at Israeli Zionist politics itself, we see that it comes from the experience of Jewish people who were in Europe. And so there's a huge racial divide amongst Jewish people within Israel itself, as well as globally, right? And it's the Euro-American Jewish perspective and Zionist politics that dominates politics within Israel. And so within Israel, there is a really serious problem of race itself. Racism, both as it divides Jewish people, places them in very different situations, and opens up the possibilities for very kinds of different relationships with Arab Jews who live in other parts of the Middle East. Even in countries like Iran, we have Jewish population that lives there. And so that kind of reveals the racial politics within the Zionist state, but also provides a way of building different kinds of alliances with black and brown Jewish communities that have lived in Africa, in the Middle East. It creates, so on the one hand, I think it helps you to kind of redefine Zionist politics as coming from a particular sector of the Jewish community's experience, right? And if we look at other Jewish communities, then it allows the possibility for different kinds of relations with Arabs who are not Jews, with Muslims, Christians. So in the case of Israel, I think that's an important issue. Israel, of course, is a highly militarized society, and we see that militarization, a kind of hyper-masculine society, if I can say that. And you see that women serving in the military, you see the masculinization of women, right? So I think that living in a security state like Israel, Zionist state, that gender politics are very central to how the state and that society itself is organized. Through the militarization of that society, that's one obvious way in which that's the case. There are many, many others, but as you said, it's a long answer, a long kind of question to put at this time of the day. In terms of Palestinian society, I also think that, gender is central to how Palestinians have kind of struggled back. Palestinian women have played a leading role in the resistance against Zionism, in the fight against the occupation. 25 years ago, I went to Palestine. I spent many months in Gaza, and every Palestinian woman that I met at that time, this was a long time ago, would say, and every young Palestinian woman that I met would say, I'm going to have lots of children because I want my children to fight against the occupation of my country, right? And so the kinds of resistance that was being articulated, which you still continue to hear from Palestinian women who live there in the refugee camps, that it was in a very gendered way that they were thinking of their own resistance. It's not that they weren't also involved at other levels of political struggle, but the way in which the nation was being imagined and the role of Palestinian women was being imagined at that time was in very, very gendered kind of terms. So, these are just ways in which I would use a kind of race and gender lens to look at that. But of course, central would be colonial occupation, which is by definition a racial project.
And they're going to walk out of this building and they're going to walk out into the world that happens outside downtown Victoria. And I'm curious for you, what keeps you going in all of this?
Well, I was just asking myself as I was. What is it? Sorry?
Really, how can you keep going? How do you keep going?
Well, I don't know. That's a kind of difficult question because there's nothing else I can do, I guess. I don't know where to begin answering that question. I really don't. I wish there was a nice, because I'm trying to figure out that answer myself. Because I am exhausted. But I don't know how anybody answers that question. What keeps you going is because it needs to be done.
Okay, well, I think that's a good note to end on. It needs to be done, and it's wonderful that Sunera keeps going.